What is going on, everybody? So today we're going to talk about the Pyroclasm shotgun, and this is over 400k DPS being done, and I am being blown away by how much damage this shotgun does. Okay, this shotgun, it's been one of my favorite shotguns for quite a while now, and I've been waiting to make this build for a while, so let's get into it. Before we get into the weapon itself, you have to go over what is burn, because the Pyroclasm is a burn weapon. Alright, and burn at its base, you deal 12% PSI intensity as status damage every half a second for 6 seconds, up to 5 stacks. That is a base of 5 stacks, okay? That is not any mods or anything, that is just a base of 5 stacks. The additional damage is Blaze Element, which cannot crit, and it cannot strike weak spots, okay? It will not decay distance. So the important things here to look at, especially for the Pyroclasm itself, okay, is going to be this 12% PSI intensity as status damage. This won't matter as much with this specific weapon, which we're going to get into that. Alright, so I'll get into the weapon itself, the Pyroclasm, and this is where it gets a little bit weird and complicated, and this is how it differs from the other burn weapons, okay? So this weapon has a base 27% chance to trigger burn on hit. That is extremely low. That is ridiculously low. It does proc more than you think. But that's just an insanely low proc right there. Okay, then this next line right here is how the Pyroclasm does its damage, okay? These 3 next lines are the most important things for this weapon. So, has a 20% chance to generate a deviant particle, which can be picked up to enter charge state, okay? Now, deviant particles are what you see me picking up right now. If you've ever used the Pyro crossbow, they look very similar and work almost the same way. Now, you only get a base 20% chance, which we're going to end up increasing that later on when we equip the key item. All right, and this next part is totally different, and it is extremely weird if you have never used this weapon before. So, if you're loading while in a charged state, after you pick up the low deviant particles, the ammunition will be replaced with Dragon's Breath rounds. Okay? Dragon's Breath attacks deal Blaze Elemental weapon damage equal to 95% attack. The burn damage bonus applies. Now, so what this is stating is that your first magazine is basically going to do no damage at all. It is going to be literal garbage damage. And once you get to the second magazine, as long as you pick up those deviant particles, you would then trigger the Dragon's Breath rounds, okay? And these Dragon's Breath rounds are extremely strong, okay? Now, they do deal Blaze Elemental damage. However, they base their damage off of weapon damage, okay? This is why it's a little bit different. So, Dragon's Breath does benefit from Blaze Elemental damage, but it also benefits from weapon damage, okay? And it does also add on or multiply with the burn damage that you have. This right here, attached to Blaze Elemental weapon damage, all this is saying is that when you reload your magazine, your very first magazine, and you have picked up those little deviant ball thingies that are being tossed all around at you, your next entire magazine, and potentially your next further magazines as well, will deal Blaze Element damage. Now, so the 3 biggest things here to look at is that you want element damage on your weapon. Okay, it does say Blaze Element damage, but element damage counts as Blaze damage. All right, if you get a weapon substat on your mod, it does help a little bit. It's not going to be a huge amount. And you also want a burn damage affix on your mods, which we're going to get into that when we get into the mod section. Now, you're probably wondering why I didn't say status damage. That's because the Dragon's Breath rounds do not deal status damage. They don't benefit from it. I'm not saying status damage is completely useless, because this weapon still does apply burn stacks, which burn stacks are literally status damage stacks. So if you were to get Blaze and Burn both on the substats, that would be good, okay? Because that Blaze damage is going to be the element damage, and that Burn damage is going to be that status damage. So your main damage is that Blaze elemental weapon damage that you were dealing out after you reload your magazine. Your burn procs still matter, and they can still do a significant amount of damage, okay? But then getting on the 4th line, Blaze damage plus 20%. Okay, reloading consumes all charge stacks, with each charge stack provides an additional 8% increase in Blaze damage, up to a maximum of 4 stacks until the next reload. So this is also depending on your reload. I said first mag, no damage. When you reload, you will also be getting an additional 8% blaze damage for all 4 of those golden balls that you pick up. No, I'm not going to get tired of saying that, even though it sounds really weird. So basically, if you haven't noticed yet, this whole weapon is dependent around these deviated particles to do the most damage. Without these deviated particles, this weapon would suck. And it did just get changed recently, which is very, very nice. Now it actually feels really good to use. So now when you use this weapon and you switch weapons, you won't lose those stacks, you will keep them. Because it used to be if you switched weapons, like to mark whatever you're going to do, you lost all of those stacks that were giving you that extra damage, and your Dragon's Breath rounds were gone. So you couldn't mark again, you couldn't do anything again, you just had to keep shooting. Alright, and so getting into the weapons mod, this is very important as well. We're running Flame Resonance, okay? Now, Flame Resonance will give you max burn stacks +2 and actually increase your damage over time, okay? Now, burn duration is minus 20%, but that is not the biggest deal. We are not losing anything with this mod. We are gaining +2 burn stacks, which that on any burn weapon, even if it doesn't rely solely on the burn, is still passive DPS. All right, and getting the attribute effects, we are running this in a burn suffix mod, because remember, burn damage benefits this weapon, and so does blaze damage. So having both of those on this weapon benefits it for even more damage. So element damage is basically the same exact thing as blaze damage, okay? They are just worded differently, but they are basically the same exact thing. And burn damage is technically the same thing as status damage. They're just worded differently. However, for this weapon's case, it does not really benefit from the status damage that you would get from a talents mod, but it would be benefiting from the burn damage attribute that we have on this weapon. It is really weird how that works. Technically, you're getting status damage either way, but just with a burn substat instead of a status subset. So I would 100% recommend getting a burn suffix mod. All right, and so getting into weapon accessories, we are running the extended break, the tactical laser sight, and we are using shotgun AP ammo. So the key for most shotguns in this game, Pyroclasm included, is you want to try to max out your accuracy as much as possible. The stability isn't the biggest deal. That's just when you're shooting and your weapon goes up and down, up and down. However, if you aim down sights, your stability is at 100%. Regardless, your accuracy, however, is how tight your bullet spread is, which especially with shotguns like corrosion and the Pyroclasm, you want your bullet spread to be as tight as possible. All right, so getting weapons calibration. Now, this is going to be a little bit weird, seeing how I just went on and on about crit rate and stuff like that. However, you do want this in a rapid double elemental calibration, okay? The reason for that is because, yes, we are trying to get as much crit damage as possible, as much crit rate as possible. However, elemental damage is what the blaze is. So by increasing your element damage, you are essentially increasing that blaze damage that this weapon will be doing. Okay, we will already have an insane amount of crit damage and crit rate. You do not need that on this calibration. You're going to be boosting that blaze damage, and then that blaze damage is going to crit, and it is going to do even more damage than you would do with a double crit rate. All right, so getting the secondary weapon, we will be using the DE50 Wildfire. Now, this time for this build, the secondary does matter because we're not using just proc bullseye. And the reason we're using the DE50 over stuff like Bingo, for example, is because of this second line right here. If there are no enemies within the area, weapon damage plus 25% for 10 seconds. Okay, so that means like if it's like a boss or just a lone enemy in general, you will be applying that 25% weapon damage. And well, Pyroclasm deals most of its damage through Elemental Blaze weapon damage. So you're going to be adding on an additional 25% on top of that for even more damage. All right, so getting the melee, we are using the Kuriki, which I know I go on and on about the Kuriki. I know you see everybody using it, slicing their ice cubes. The Kuriki with the Pyroclasm is absolute god tier, and it benefits you so much. So when you're defeating a target, it grants all weapons attack plus 30%. Okay, that's huge. If that wasn't enough, you're going to be getting plus 15% crit rate as well. And here comes the big juicy part. When defeating an enemy with a heavy strike, PSI intensity plus 20%. So you're getting 3 wins here for the Pyroclasm, because it deals burn status damage, which is going to go off of the PSI intensity, okay, and it also benefits from the attack 30%, and it also the blaze elemental damage also crits. So you're getting 3 buffs from this one melee right here. You literally only have to melee a cube to get these buffs, okay? You just want to heavy swing the cube and you will have that buff, okay? And it is so nice. Yes, it's only for 10 seconds, but it's so fast and easy to do. And the amount of damage you do get from this is absolutely insane. All right, so again, the crit build. Now, this is the build that you should be running the majority of the time. This is the build that will give you the most damage overall, whether it's silos, monoliths, or Leah Labs, or Nightmare Styles, whatever you're doing. This is the build that you do want. Now, to start this build off, you will be running this with a 2-piece slow-mo set, okay? So you're going to be getting that magazine capacity, which is nice, but you're also going to be getting that additional 5% crit rate. And we need more crit rate for this weapon because you want all those blaze elemental weapon damage shotgun rounds to crit, okay? That's how you're going to get your damage. So that also benefits very well. And we are running this with a 3-piece Treacherous Tide set, okay? And this is big. This is really big. I'm going to explain in a second. But so a 2-piece is going to be getting weapon damage and status damage plus 12%. And I know I said status damage doesn't really have as much impact with the Pyroclasm because it deals most of its damage to the blaze elemental weapon damage. That is true. So you are getting that weapon damage increase. However, that burn proc, you will still be proccing burn. Okay, and burn is a status effect. And you can get that burn proc still extremely, extremely high and get very, very good passive damage, okay? That is how weapons like Boom Boom do most of their damage, through those burn procs. Just in this weapon's case, you are getting that big, big blaze elemental weapon damage, and as well, you are getting burn stacks as well for that passive damage. It's not going to be nearly as much as like Boom Boom's passive damage. However, that's not your main source of damage. However, more status means higher burn procs, which means more damage overall. Alright, once you get the 3 pieces of Treacherous Tide set, HP reduction from low sanity is decreased by 40%. Weapon and status damage plus 10%, and further increases as your sanity drops up to 28%. So you will get an additional or up to 28% more status and weapon damage, okay? Now with the 3-piece Treacherous Tide set, in total, between that 12% and that 28%, you will be getting 40% status damage increase. This build is incredible, especially for the Pyroclasm. Alright, so again, the mods for this build, for the helmet mod, we are running Faithful Strike. And Faithful Strike, you cannot deal weak spot damage, crit rate plus 10%, and crit damage plus 30%. Okay, that's good for the Pyroclasm because we are trying to get that crit rate up for those fire-breathing rounds. And those fire-breathing rounds can crit, so they are getting an additional 30% increase in damage. But the big key thing here is that crit damage that you see right there. Now, ideally, you can actually get that up to 30% crit damage. So it could be a little bit higher for us, but this is ideally what you would want. Now, if you do end up getting a crit weapon damage or even a status elemental one, they will still work. They're not bad at all. All of them came really, really close in the testing that I did. This build is about a mixture of both elemental, status, crit, and weapon damage. Alright, so again, the mass mod, we are running Retrusion Explosion in a burn affix, okay? Now, Retrusion Explosion, when hitting burning enemies, crit rate plus 8% and crit damage plus 20%, which is good because we're trying to gain as much crit rate and we're also gaining an additional 20% crit damage. So this mod is perfect for the Pyroclasm. As well, we are running this in a burn affix for burn damage and blaze damage, okay? We also got lucky with the damage against normal enemies, and the trigger chance isn't really needed, but it's nice to have, even though it doesn't really do much. But for the chest mod, we are running Critical Rescue and a Lunar affix, so you get damage reduction plus 20% and healing received plus 20%. Really, we're only running this because it's a Lunar suffix mod, and we are going for crit damage, and we did get weapon damage on it as well. Now, if you do end up getting element damage in place of that weapon damage, it is okay because that will still benefit you. Element, crit, and weapon damage are all beneficial. And if you don't have a Lunar mod, you can just go for a Violent suffix for the crit damage. And for the Pants mod, we are running Deadshot, which Deadshot with each crit hit by non-melee weapon grants plus 5% crit damage up to 45%. Now we are on this one in a Violent suffix for the crit damage, and we as well do get lucky that golden weapon damage. Now, there is an alternative to this if you wanted to run, okay? And I have been on the edge about this one as well. Both of them are viable options. You could run Critical Surge in place of Deadshot, because when you're reloading consistently with the Pyroclasm, you're losing those damage stacks that you're getting with Deadshot. However, with Critical Surge, your crit stacks are stacking on top of each other over and over and over for 12 seconds. So you can technically have a 45% crit damage, and not just when you get to that 45%, you reload and it's gone. And for Ghost Mod, we are running Crit Amplifier. Once again, we get some more crit rate, 10%, and we get an additional 15% crit damage. Now, the reason we're not running the other one is because we don't need an additional 5% crit rate, and the 15% crit damage is actually way more beneficial than 5 additional crit rate. So this just gives you the best of both worlds, 10% crit rate and crit damage 15%. Once again, we are running this in a violent suffix for that crit damage, and we did get extremely lucky with that weapon damage. Now, I do have some really, really nice crit and weapon damage mods. Okay, that is why I'm showing them to you. It is okay if you do not have these mods, okay? You will still do extremely good damage with this weapon, I promise you. Again, in the base mod, we're running Rush Hour, which I run Rush Hour for all my builds, like every single one of them. So every 10% HP loss grants 4% melee weapon and status damage. So the melee damage, we're not worrying about that right now. The weapon damage, we need that. That's really good. The status damage is also good because remember those burn procs, okay? Those burn procs are status damage still. So that's going to be giving us an additional up to 40% technically, but you'd be dead. So really, if you really wanted to max this out, you really could go to like 36%. 36% is still a lot. Even if you were only half HP, you would still be getting more than a mod like Covered Advanced. So we are also running this one in a violence suffix. Once again, more crit damage and weapon damage. I did get really lucky with all my violent mods, which makes me kind of upset because my talents mods aren't nearly as good as my violent ones are. But now getting the key item for the pyroclasm, okay? This is very important right here. Very, very important. Okay, you're going to want to run the Fire Ruin Boots. However, these are the key items essentially made for the pyroclasm. And what these do, when any target nearby is afflicted with burn, there's a 50% chance to generate a deviant particle. That's cool and all, but that's not like what we're really after. Picking it up increases the blaze damage by 30% for 15 seconds. That is the part that we're after for even more blaze damage. Now, as you can see here, when I shoot this dummy and I pick up that deviated particle, I go back to check my stats, and I will have an additional 30% blaze damage, okay? That is not including the weapon's reload of those deviated particles, which is going to be even more. Basically, the whole point of this entire build is to collect these golden balls, deviant particles, whatever you want to call them, and you just want to stack as much blaze damage as possible. And that is the main focus of this build, and just straight wreck everything in your path. And I do try to keep these as simple as possible for you guys without going into too much detail in the math and stuff like that, because I feel like if I had to watch a video where I was listening to much math, I'd fall asleep personally. So I do all that for you guys. Don't worry about that. All right, so now getting in the Cradle, we are going to be running Anti-Void for that shotgun extra damage that you'll be getting. Also, we're running Status Enhancement, Tactical Combo, Elemental Sense, and Burn's only Cradle option at the moment, which is very strong. It will give you more burn damage, and it will also inflict an instance of burn damage on an enemy. All right, and that takes care of all your necessary elemental Cradle perks that you need. Now, what I would recommend is you put March Strike on, so you will be using Bullseye, Bounty Hunter, and then your last one should be Tactical Leap. This Cradle perk is severely underrated, and I feel like not enough people know how good this actual perk is, okay? It gives you 20% damage against deviants, okay? And damage against their shields. And all you gotta do for this is you just gotta get in the air, which I know doesn't seem possible when gravity isn't turned on, right? Or there's a way to, you can either do it through double jump drinks, or you can use spring legs. So as you're just walking or running, just jump up in the air. You will be losing stamina really fast. However, as you are jumping, you will be gaining those stacks of Tactical Leap. So that's a really good way to constantly keep it on you at all times, especially through like silos, monoliths, and all that type of stuff. And for the Deviation, we are running PYRO Dino, which if you don't know who PYRO Dino is, have you played once, human? Are you sure? I mean, honestly, if I'm going to be completely honest with all of you, PYRO Dino is on a different level than any deviant I've ever seen. He can basically turn any burn build into just a god-killing machine. If you've ever used PYRO Dino or you've seen him, what he does, you'll see what I'm talking about. He's probably the only deviant in the whole game that can solo probably 80%, 85% of the game by himself. Okay, and he also increases the target blaze damage received by 39.2%. Now we do have a level 5 lunar PYRO Dino, so I will additionally get an extra 5% status damage. Now, a regular PYRO Dino is perfectly okay, all right? You can still do a ton of damage. PYRO Dino is no joke. He makes burn builds ridiculous, okay? He is crazy. And for the food buffs, depending on if you're a chef class or not, this would depend on whether you could take 2 buffs or not. So for most people, you want to run the surprise spring roll. Now, I would normally tell you to run something like the hot dog or maybe something with more crit damage in it. However, the surprise spring roll will give you between 5 to 15% extra elemental damage, which elemental damage is blaze damage, which this will also, if you're below 40% HP, this will also double. So you could be getting up to 30% increased elemental damage. Now, technically, you could also run the hearty meat stew. I do not have that recipe. I've played Winter 3 times and still somehow not grabbed it, but that would give you an extra 30% blaze damage increase. So that is ideally what you would want. However, the surprise spring roll works just as well. But if you are a chef class, you can run this and you could also run the hot dog if you want. Now, if you don't want to run the hot dog, okay, and I have tested this. I just tested this actually. The flaming egg tart, I don't know why they named it that. You just increase your burn damage by 10%. That doesn't seem like a whole lot. And why would we worry about burn damage when we're trying to get more crit off of the blaze damage, right? Well, this burn damage actually factors in to the pyroclasm's dragon breath rounds, okay? Because remember when we were talking about the weapon? It said the burn damage bonus applies to it. This gets calculated into that dragon's breath ammo's damage, okay? So I did just test this. It does work. You do get a decent more amount of damage. I'm not going to say a whole lot. However, it is pretty nice how this works. I did not think it was going to work, so I tested it. It does give you that bonus though, and it's a lot more than I thought it would be. So you could either run Flaming Egg Tart and Splash Ring Roll for 2 elemental buffs if you really want to, or you could run one of these with a hot dog if you want to. Or if you don't want to run either of the elemental buffs, you could run hot dog and you could run roulette dumplings, okay? Roulette dumplings are a little oracle thing. You have to keep eating these until you get the specific one that you want. And for the drink buff, we'll be running Whimsical Drink, which Whimsical Drink is the god drink of the whole game. It's the holy Jesus of once human. It will give you base 25% status damage bonus. I mean, there is no other drink buff that you really can have for this build, for any status build, I guess. So I would always go for Whimsical Drink. Once again, if you are a chef class though, I mean, you could stack this with something like Double Jump, or you could even put on iced tea if you really wanted to. Now, overall, I would say the Pyroclasm is definitely one of my favorite weapons. I've been waiting so long to make this weapon, and I'm so glad I did. And I really hope you guys did enjoy it too. Now, there are other ways to build this weapon. We will get into that into the future. But for now, have fun blasting away.